Warm beanie on, long coat, mask to hide behind. On my first visit, the betting shops had been abandoned, and a lone couple sat in the doorway having their lunch. The only shop still open was the bubble tea store on the corner, solely for takeaway. I checked around me as I pulled my phone out. I was there photographing the Georgian facades, trying to find a hint of history. I recalled a line from Patrick Keeler's Robinson in Ruins. He surveyed the centre of the island on which he was shipwrecked, the location of a great malady that I shall dispel in the manner of Turner, by making picturesque views on journeys to sites of scientific and historic interest. Some scraps of paper blew down the street. I tucked my phone back in my pocket, checking again to see if anyone had noticed. I had a vague notion that me being here would inspire my political motivations. The radicals of the past came here, and maybe it would be the same for me. This had been the site of a lecture hall, where many meetings took place. It was demolished in 1964. I shuffled up the street a bit, didn't want to seem like I was loitering. I was about to head home when I happened upon Joseph Cowen sat on the bench outside. He nodded towards me. I welcomed his company. I told him of my desire to be more political. He had a slightly confused look on his face.
More political? Than what?
Than before I started this project. I'm not sure where to start. I know it's vague. I have a strong desire to take part in the shaping of society and do more than what's expected of me. I hope that by visiting sites of historic radicalism I could begin that process. It's how I met you.
We had our fair share of problems. The Charter's demands still hadn't been met. There was rising nationalism across Europe. The issue of workers' rights was especially present here on Tyneside. You should come back here again.
I said I would. We parted ways. When we returned, I had exhibited a series of my maps around the street. We walked around, exploring each of them. The first one was a mess of lines and collaging. I told him that I had sat on the street as I made it. I was uncomfortable there, so my drawings were hurried.
Why were you uncomfortable?
It seemed like a strange thing to do. I guess it was strange for everyone else too.
You need to locate yourself within the street more. I once walked at the head of a labour procession through Newcastle in 1873. I heard vehement calls for my hanging from shopkeepers. After that, Engels hoped that I would lead a new proletarian party.
I'm not standing at the side of the street looking sheepish anymore. I've been to visit many times since we last spoke. Not being deterred by others has meant I've found more of the hidden value in the street.
What were you drawing here?
I was illustrating everyone who passed by, where they came from, what I overheard, what I imagined they would do next. It helped me recognise my presence on the street.
You agree that is a privileged position to have?
Of course. I acknowledge those that had to occupy the street out of necessity, the rough sleepers, the buskers. I know I can choose to come and go as I wish. I hope that through the development of a self-reflective mode of practice, I can consider the street and its inhabitants more holistically. The next drawing was complicated, strewn with a multitude of signs and symbols. Cowen talked about where his motivation came from.
Any campaign should recognise the actual circumstances faced by those outside, rather than imposing values forged by the more placid British environments. For me, it was a principle of respect, empathy even, for experiences and opinions of those who lent us assistance. Are you being more empathetic?
I've been illustrating my emotional entanglement with the street. As Tim Morton writes, reframing our world, our problems and ourselves as part of the ecological project. That is what praxis means. Action that is thoughtful and thought that is active.
You're hoping that by conducting continuous research on this street, that a greater sense of place will arise?
Yes, a more ecologically orientated mode of practice and a better understanding of my relationship with the street. I paced back and forth in front of this one.
It is about seeing from other perspectives too? Or just mine?
Not just you. I've also begun to ask the non-human on this street. Ian Burgost writes of an object-orientated ontology, which puts things at the centre of being. We humans are elements, but not the sole elements of philosophical interest. That which is hidden and ignored. I've had conversations with a bin. We moved on to the next map. I stared more. I thought of the bin again. When I first encountered it, I paid little attention, drew only a small square in the corner. For a time, I thought that someone was trapped in it. Or that's how I wrote it.
What about your new perspective on it then?
That this street is one big system, and anything on here or from here that happened here can assist me in recognising my agency for changing that system, like Tim Morton's mesh, the interconnectedness of all living and non-living things. We moved along. I wanted to speak to Cowen about the performative narratives that I'd written about and for the street, and how it differed from my usual practice. In a quotation from a paper I had found, performance is always about time, about revisiting the past, and about imagining desired futures. We traced over the map, each line corresponding to an object or event that I had encountered.
What would you normally do?
These aren't techniques that I've previously explored or even allowed myself to question. Usually we focus on objective site analysis, some paths, the frequency of people, planned sections, but that ignores personal agency. That's why my process is ethnographic and accounting for the observer. I agree with Jane Rendell, who writes that criticism itself has a spatial potential in acknowledging the specific and situated position of the critic. I moved out of the way of a street sweeper. I asked Cowen about his writing.
I had deliberately destroyed most of the material which referred to the clandestine Republican activities, particularly those papers which related to the involvement in the Orsini bomb plot to assassinate Napoleon III. A lot had been published though. I contributed mostly to the Northern Tribune and Newcastle Chronicle. You've been writing too? Why did you write this script?
For me, it seemed unnatural at first, but the writing is a way of recognising the street's performative aspects and uncovering the hidden objects. The bins, mould growth on the wall, the sandstone bricks, pieces of litter, have all become important characters in telling the story of the street. These are what my drawings focus on. I'm acknowledging the agency of those elements. This narrative explores that more ecological way of thinking.
We moved along to the next map, as Cowen recalled creating the Hungarian Refugees Committee.
These refugees were radical Democrats, so of course we had to assist where we could. I became good friends with many of them. Lekowski was one. I remember first meeting them inside the lecture hall here. We had a common ground there.
I turned to the map, using my finger to point out the relevant signatures and shading. I told Cowen how I analysed the site using my existing architectural skills. This drawing started out with an orthographic representation of the mould on the bricks.
But how does that change your practice?
I've disrupted the drawing by layering. This creates a dialogue within. The narratives themselves give rise to certain forms. On one layer I use symbolic expression to relate my research to the orthographic. This is a close relation of the inherent complexity and messiness that exists on the site. I then add my own thoughts about the changing nature of the site, its temporality and fluidity. These different characters I've met throughout my time on the street have an opportunity to emerge too. The interconnections can be found throughout. The drawings illustrate my developed subjectivity and my progressing dialogues with the ecologies I've experienced, a subversion of my previously orthodox ways of practicing.
Lekowski wrote to me with invisible ink. Perhaps you and I have similarly seditious ways of working.
While Tim Morton suggests our intimacy with other beings is full of ambiguity and darkness, the practice of making the drawing leads to thoughtful action within.
We left the drawing where it was. I was reminded of a quotation from a book of short stories. By placing the drawing on the site, I had delivered it up to the inclemencies of sun and winters. I expect the tattered ruins of the map to still remain. I got distracted by a seagull flying overhead. Cowen got up to leave.
Do you think you've come far since then?
Yes, I do. I thanked him for our debate. As I turned beyond my summation of the project, Cowen's questioning still lingers.